In 1994, a man named Fred Boyce was driving through Massachusetts. A news report came on his car radio. A government committee had just revealed something horrifying. Children at a state institution had been fed radioactive cereal. The institution was the Fernald State School in Waltham. Boyce had lived there as a child and eaten that cereal. He'd been a member of that club, they described. For 45 years, he believed joining the science club meant someone cared about him. That morning, sitting in his car on the side of the road, he learned what it actually meant. He was a test subject, and he had always been one. And the people who fed him that breakfast had known exactly what they were doing. The Fernald State School was founded in 1848 as the Massachusetts School for the Feeble-Minded. It was the first publicly funded institution for developmentally disabled people in the Western Hemisphere. By the early 1900s, its superintendent, Walter E. Fernald, had turned it into something else entirely. Fernald sat on the board of the Eugenics Society. He believed certain people were genetically inferior and should be separated from the rest of society permanently. Under his leadership, the school stopped being a school. It became a warehouse. Children were committed there not because they were disabled, but because they were inconvenient. Orphans, foster kids who had run out of foster homes, poor children from broken families, kids who misbehaved or tested below average on IQ exams that have since been thoroughly discredited. At its peak, the institution held roughly 2,500 people across 72 buildings on nearly 200 acres. Historian Michael D'Antonio estimated that at least half the residents would function normally in today's world. Across the country, during the worst decades of the eugenics movement, approximately 200,000 relatively normal children were locked away in more than 100 similar institutions. They were labeled with clinical terms: idiot, imbecile, moron. These were official medical classifications stamped on their permanent records. Fred Boyce was 7 years old when the state of Massachusetts committed him to Fernald. His mother had abandoned him. He had been a ward of the state since he was 8 months old. He had already lived in 7 foster homes. When his last foster mother died, the state needed somewhere to put him. Fernald was easier than finding another family, so they sent him through the iron gates and stamped his file with a single word: moron. His intelligence tested within the normal range. He simply had never been educated. The conditions inside Fernald were exactly what you would expect from a place designed to make children disappear. Staff forced boys to sit on wooden benches for hours with their arms folded. If you unfolded your arms, you were hit. Children performed unpaid manual labor, making brooms, brushes, and furniture, doing maintenance, preparing food. They received almost no education. The most capable residents kept the institution running, while the institution kept them invisible. One building was later described as a place where human waste covered the floors and drugged residents sat half-dressed in rows, moaning. Visitors who came decades later confirmed those descriptions were accurate. This was the daily reality for thousands of American children whose only crime was being born into circumstances no one wanted to deal with. And it was into this environment, in the fall of 1949, that researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology arrived with an idea. MIT created something called the Science Club. The pitch was simple. Join the club and you would get things no child at Fernald ever received: extra food, trips outside the institution, tickets to Boston Red Sox games, Mickey Mouse watches, attention from adults who seemed to care. About 90 boys signed up. Fred Boyce was one of them. He later said that life at Fernald was so brutal he would have volunteered for anything. If the scientist had offered an outing in exchange for eating arsenic, his hand would have gone up. The boys did not know what they were joining. Their parents, for those who had parents, received a letter from the superintendent describing special breakfast meals that would help improve the children's nutrition. The letter never mentioned radiation. It never mentioned radioactive isotopes. It used opt-out consent, meaning silence was treated as agreement. And for the children who were wards of the state, the superintendent himself signed the consent forms. The same man who ran the institution approved the experiments on the children in his care. There was no independent oversight. There was no one whose job it was to ask whether this was acceptable. Between 1946 and 1953, MIT professor of nutrition Robert S. Harris and his team conducted 3 separate experiments on Fernald residents. In the first, boys ate oatmeal coated with radioactive iron tracers across 7 meals. Their spleens absorbed between 544 and 1024 millirems of radiation. In the second, 36 boys drank milk containing radioactive calcium traces. In the third, 9 boys were injected directly with radioactive calcium through a syringe. The subjects were between 10 and 17 years old. The total number of children involved was at least 74. Here is the part that should make you set down whatever you were eating. The entire reason these experiments existed was a cereal marketing war. In the late 1940s, Quaker oats and cream of wheat were competing for dominance in the American breakfast market. Recent studies had suggested that a chemical called phytate, found naturally in oats, interfered with iron absorption. This gave cream of wheat a potential nutritional advantage. Quaker oats needed data to fight back, so Quaker supplied the cereal. MIT received funding through a named Quaker Oats Fellowship. The United States Atomic Energy Commission supplied the radioactive isotopes, and the Fernald State School supplied the children. 74 boys fed radioactive breakfast so a cereal company could win a marketing argument. The results were exactly what Quaker wanted. Oatmeal was no worse than cream of wheat at promoting iron absorption. That finding went straight into advertising. The calcium injection study produced something else. Researchers discovered that calcium deposits directly into bones after entering the bloodstream. That became foundational research for osteoporosis science. Every time you hear that milk builds strong bones, there is a line that connects back to Fernald. 9 boys were injected with radioactive material without their knowledge or consent. That nutritional fact was purchased with something that was not for sale. Now, the strongest counter-argument. Multiple task forces concluded that the radiation doses were small. A 1994 Massachusetts state panel found no measurable health effects. The exposure was roughly equivalent to receiving 30 consecutive chest X-rays, which sounds alarming but falls within ranges that do not typically cause detectable harm. I sat with that fact for a long time. It almost closed the door for me. If no one was physically injured, what exactly is the crime? Then I read the full testimony. A researcher named Bertrand Brill from MIT was asked about the choice of test subjects. Under pressure, he admitted the truth plainly. They should not have used a group that had no way to say no. That sentence reframes everything. The damage was not the radiation. The damage was a system that manufactured consent from people who had no ability to refuse. Children without parents. Children whose legal guardian was the same person approving the experiments. Children who had been classified as subhuman by the state that was supposed to protect them. The radiation was the method. The real violation was the architecture that made these children available. They had been erased from society before the first spoonful of oatmeal ever reached their mouths. And Fernald was not an isolated case. When the story broke in December 1993, it triggered something much larger. Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary launched a federal investigation into government-sponsored radiation experiments. President Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments in January 1994. Over 18 months, the committee reviewed millions of declassified pages from 6 cabinet offices. What they found was staggering. Between 1944 and 1974, the United States government had sponsored several thousand human radiation experiments on an estimated 20,000 or more unwitting American citizens. At Vanderbilt University in the 1940s, 800 pregnant women were given radioactive iron in drinks described as vitamins. At the University of Iowa in 1953, newborn babies were fed radioactive iodine. In Cincinnati between 1960 and 1971, 200 cancer patients, mostly poor, mostly black, were irradiated without informed consent while being told they were receiving treatment. Prisoners in Washington and Oregon state prisons were used for radiation tests. More than 200,000 military personnel were exposed during atomic weapons tests. 18 people were injected with plutonium at hospitals across the country. Most of them were poor. Most of them were sick. None of them were told what was being put into their veins. In Hanford, Washington, in 1949, the Atomic Energy Commission deliberately released iodine-131 into the atmosphere, contaminating 500,000 acres, including 3 small towns. And here is the detail that should keep you awake. A 1947 internal AEC memorandum recommended that these experiments not be made public. The reason, stated in a direct quote from a government document, was that it might have an adverse effect on public opinion or result in legal suits. They knew. They knew it was wrong. They said so in writing. And they did it anyway because the people they were doing it to did not have the power to stop them. The test subjects were always drawn from the same pool: the institutionalized, the imprisoned, the terminally ill, the poor, the abandoned, the people society had already decided did not count. The advisory committee's final report was released on October 3, 1995, at a White House ceremony. President Clinton called the experiments morally troubling and issued a formal apology. Fred Boyce was there. He watched the president speak. And later he said it was not enough to compensate these guys who had their lives ruined because people were trying to do good. But here is something almost no one mentions about that date. October 3, 1995. The single most significant revelation about government experimentation on American citizens was released to the public on the exact same day the entire country was watching the O.J. Simpson verdict. The biggest news cycle in a generation swallowed the story whole. Whether that timing was terrible luck or something more deliberate, I cannot say for certain. But the result was the same. The country barely noticed. I need to be honest about something. There is a version of this story that is easier to tell. The version where you focus on the radiation, call it monstrous, and move on. The clean outrage version. But that version lets the system off the hook, because the radiation experiments lasted 7 years. Fred Boyce's institutionalization lasted 11. The label on his file lasted his entire life. He left Fernald at 19 with almost no ability to read. He cleaned up after Red Sox games at Fenway Park. He washed dishes. He eventually bought a portable carnival game booth and traveled the circuit because his lack of education closed every other door. He taught himself to read as an adult. He married. He raised a family. He built a life from materials most people would consider nothing. And he spent decades fighting for one thing that had nothing to do with radioactive cereal. He wanted the state of Massachusetts to remove the word moron from his records. He wanted an apology, not for the experiments, for being told he was not part of the species, for being locked behind iron gates at age 7 because the state found it easier than finding him a home. He never received that apology. When Fred Boyce died on May 6, 2006, at the age of 65, the word moron was still on his file. The class action lawsuit against MIT and Quaker Oats settled in January 1998 for $1.85 million. Split among claimants, each person received roughly $20,000 to $30,000. MIT's vice president compared the total settlement to the tuition of 20 students. Quaker Oats denied playing a significant role, claiming they only donated some cereal and provided a small research grant. No individual researcher was ever criminally charged. Konstantin Maletskos, the MIT researcher who studied how the boys metabolized radioactive calcium, was interviewed decades later. His response has stayed with me since I first read it. He said he felt just as good about the experiments as the day he conducted them. Just as good. About feeding radioactive material to children who could not refuse. That sentence is its own verdict. The Fernald campus closed its doors for the last time on November 13, 2014, when the final resident was discharged. The buildings still stand, but not for long. They are being demolished. In January 2024, a journalist named Oliver Egger, who is Walter Fernald's own great-great-grandson, discovered that thousands of confidential patient records had been left on the abandoned campus. Medical files. Personal histories. The documentation of lives spent inside those walls, just sitting there for anyone to find, a violation of federal privacy law confirmed by the state. And in April 2025, a 4-alarm fire swept through the site. The physical evidence of what happened at Fernald is disappearing. The buildings are coming down, the records were left to rot, and then to burn. The campus is on fire, and nobody seems troubled by what the flames are consuming. You probably had cereal this morning, or yesterday, or you will tomorrow. Somewhere in the long chain of nutritional science that shapes your breakfast, there are 74 boys who were never asked. Boys who thought joining a club meant someone finally saw them as human. Boys who discovered 45 years later that they were data points in a marketing study funded by a company that sold oatmeal. I think about what Fred Boyce said when he learned the truth. He did not describe rage, he did not describe shock. He called it a disappointing type of feeling. That is the word a man uses when betrayal is so familiar it no longer surprises him. When being used is just another version of being forgotten. When the people who were supposed to protect you turn out to be the ones who handed you over. Every morning, millions of people pour cereal into a bowl without knowing the smallest part of where the science came from, without knowing who was fed what, without knowing their names. The Fernald campus is burning, and nobody is asking what is being lost in the fire. The records were left behind. The buildings are coming down. The word moron is still on Fred Boyce's file. And the cereal is still on the shelf.